A little background first before we kind of field for some questions to make sure I cover the things that I'll talk about. But anyway, so I'm Jay Kaminski. I started shooting, actually my first arrow was when I was 6 years old. My dad won a bow at a gun raffle when I was 5 years old, and it was an adult hunting compound. And there was no way I was pulling back a 60-pound bow at 5 years old. So we found a bear. It's literally called a bear bow, a bear compound bow, from Kmart, which is a department store back in the States that's since gone out of business. Anyway, I got it for my 6th birthday, shot my first arrow on my 6th birthday, found a local junior development program in the States. It's called JOAD in USA Archery, Junior Olympic Archery Development Program. It's since changed names and stuff, but anyway, I started shooting there probably around the age of 7 or 8, and shot compound actually for 6 years before I switched to recurve. I switched to recurve when I was about 12 years old, give or take. And the reason I did switch to recurve, well, first I had developed target panic with a compound pretty bad, and it was getting frustrating. So I switched to recurve for a little bit of an outlet. Plus we had the New York State Empire State Games, which is like a mini Olympics, a multi-sports event. They have an opening ceremonies, a closing ceremonies. You stay in dorms, much like the Olympics. And the Western Division, which was the division I was in, was a very competitive division to become part of. And if you made the team, you won the event, basically. And so that was very exciting for me. And basically never put a recurve down from that time forward. Started becoming more serious. Went to my first Junior Olympic Nationals, actually with a compound when I was in the year 2000. But then the next one that I went to with a recurve was in 2004, and since 2004 I've gone to basically every national U.S. event, and then eventually got recruited in 2006 by Coach Lee. He actually asked me to become a Junior Dream Team member, which is kind of like above the JOAD program, pre the resident athlete program out there at the Olympic Training Center. And actually, I told him, hey, I actually applied to become an RA last week, and he said, all right, well then hopefully I'll see you in a couple months. And so I skipped the Junior Dream Team program, went straight into being a resident athlete. I lived there for about 6 years, from 2006 to 2012. Went to London, and then moved out away from the training center and continued shooting until through the year 2017. So, and since then I've basically stopped shooting. But I continue to do this type of stuff, especially a lot more so recently, specific to tuning and form. And Heather and I wrote a book in 2017 about training for archery, and that's been going over quite well, and we're looking to expand upon that. But while I was at the Olympic Training Center, we had experts of all kinds, not just specific to archery like Coach Lee. I'll argue with anybody about he's probably the most winning coach in the entire world. And so we had an expert coach. We had expert sports nutritionists, recovery people in sports medicine, physio trainers, you name it, we had access to it. So I spent years trying to piece together a training plan that made sense for me, and which was scientifically backed, and not just, oh, how many arrows are you going to shoot? Well, I shoot 300 arrows a day, or if you're Korean, I shoot 1,000 arrows every day, or whatever the number is. That didn't make sense. And, we had experts there to work with me through my deficiencies of my strength or my flexibility or recovery or nutrition to better myself as an archer or as an athlete. And, I had to leverage every opportunity I possibly could there. Plus, we had people like Doug Denton, who's been here working for Hoyt. He would go out to the training center all the time, showing us the latest bows. I'd have access to him and ask him, why do you tune your bow that way? Why do you design it that way? Why is the cutout where it is? Why is the geometry that way? And was able to assemble a massive amount of information, not just how you do it, or how the pros do it, or how the people who design the equipment do it, but why to do those things. So I'm a why guy. I have to know why I'm doing something. If the person who's trying to explain it to me can't give me the reason why, then I tend to not believe that they know either what they're talking about or if it's the best way, if they can't give me a reason. So it's really important for me, and I know all the whys of everything that I'll cover in here. If you ever want to know why I do something a specific way or suggested a specific way, I'm happy to explain it if I don't already do that. So anyway, working with Doug with the bows, working with people who are on the original design team of the X10. So why is it designed that way? Why is it shaped that way? Why does it have the weakness in the back compared to, a parallel shaft and all that stuff? Not only that, but what was the true design of it and how is it designed to be used for maximizing forgiveness? So I had unlimited access to all these experts and pros and top level people. And, I spent the time that I was there to really piece everything together. So that's kind of my background as far as in the sport outside of accolades and things like that. Yeah, that's kind of my background. So today we've got, a short time window. We can talk about anything you guys want to talk about. We'll definitely touch on some technique stuff. We'll touch on some form or some tuning stuff, some mental stuff, and whatever else you guys want to talk about. Is there anything in particular that somebody absolutely is here for a very specific thing? And don't be afraid to say it. I know we're in front of other people, but if not, then I can just kind of go through it. And like I said, if you have a question about anything, even if it's a completely different thought than what I'm talking about, that's totally okay. I'm happy to always bring it back to what I'm talking about after I answer your question, okay? So, like I said, if you're not asking the questions, that's on you, okay? I'm here for you, and I highly suggest if you have any questions at all, please ask them. It was something that I had a pet peeve of at the training center. I was the only one that went around and asked these people these questions, truly. I was the only one that assembled my own training plan while using the experts' knowledge and suggestions, instead of letting, assistant coaches make up training plans who I shot better than when they were athletes. So, anyway, please ask questions, please.
First up, can you explain finger position on the string, please? I saw your YouTube video where you were saying the blob on the front, but you said go backwards with the string and then forwards. Could you go through that again, please?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'll definitely cover that. I want to cover some really important things first, but I'll absolutely cover the string.
Somebody's going to ask a question.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. So, archery in its root form is a martial arts sport. Okay, in like Japan, I believe it's Gundo is the traditional archery, and it's Do. So Taekwondo, Aikido, Do is a Do sport. It's a martial arts sport. So it definitely requires a whole lot of discipline, a whole lot of structure, and a whole lot of repetition to make sure you're doing everything the same. And oftentimes, what is the most important things in shooting get missed. And I apologize if anybody out there has seen the recent YouTube videos that I've been putting up, so a lot of this can become redundant, but for those of you that haven't seen them, a lot of this information and a whole lot more will eventually make it onto my YouTube channel that I'm uploading at least twice a week, covering all sorts of different stuff. Right now it's mostly form and tuning, and then Heather and I just recorded a session on strength training, essentially to increase your draw weight, as well as we'll be doing a ton of other body-centric stuff, and then eventually I'm going to be getting into third-party equipment testing. So I have no sponsors anymore, and I have the ability to test things and give you guys real data and feedback and compare and contrast things out there that is not being done anywhere else. So anyway, there's three main key things that absolutely have to be in the forefront of every single shot. And feel free, by the way, anytime I'm writing or drawing or whatever, take a picture, or if I'm explaining something, feel free to take a video so you have access to that information as well. And feel free to take notes as well. So there's three really, really important things, is in no particular order. Tension and direction, rhythm and timing, and movements versus muscles. Those are like the three main things that many people forget about or don't do. All of these things are absolutely 100% applicable to compound shooters as well. So if there's anybody here that shoots compound in addition to recurve, I know a few of the staff members shoot compound. All of these things absolutely will be important and have to be primary focus. Even if you're doing different changing, you're working on your finger placement on the string, whatever, if you don't have these things, your finger placement on the string is kind of going to be irrelevant, or eventually, unless it's terrible and then you fix it, your scores will get better, but unless you're addressing and fixing these things, you're really never going to go anywhere, all right? So tension and direction is something that I can explain. If you have a 50-pound bow, you have to be pulling back 25 pounds and pushing forward 25 pounds in order to have the bow back at full draw. If you look at, and that has to be balanced. Notice I said 25 one way, 25 the other way, and that has to be continually balanced throughout the entire shot, because if the equation, just like in math or science or whatever, if it's imbalanced, it doesn't work. So if I'm pulling more than I'm pushing, I'm going to lean back, and vice versa. If I'm pushing more than I'm pulling, I'm going to lean forward. But when that shows up is most often on release, okay? Release is a reaction, not an action. So what does that mean? That means that it tells you more about what's going on during the shot, and you're not actually moving. Your follow-through, follow-through is a reaction, not an action. Follow-through tells you everything about the shot that you were doing or that your student was doing. So if somebody's at full draw and when they release, they do this, what do you think that's telling you? Their equation's imbalanced. They're pulling more than they're pushing, okay? So tension has to be balanced. It has to be balanced both sides. What you exert on the back half has to exert on the front half. In Coach Lee's method, the best method, MTS, KSL shot sequence, whatever you want to call it, you see the hand drop when you release. Most people don't understand why that happens, and that's simply to balance out what's happening on this backside. So as you're pulling through the clicker, you're exerting pressure here, you're also exerting pressure here to balance it out, but when the clicker clicks and you release and you have a follow-through happening, you're exerting energy back here, so you simply just do this to balance the equation out, and then everything ends up being a bit more stable. So that's the whole idea behind it, just to kind of illustrate the point of balance, of the tension. But what do I mean when I talk about direction? So tension has to be balanced, and direction has to be controlled. So not just the direction of your arrow, the direction of your sight pin or whatever, but the direction of the tension you're exerting on the bow. You have 2 contact points on the bow, or should only have 2 contact points. Your fingers on the string and your hand on the grip. So if that's the case, how many people do you see when they pull back their bow, pull back like this when they're pulling back? Or you see like youth archers or people who are pulling the bow back, they pull back like this. And if I had an arrow in the bow, you could see that I was pulling the bow back on the arrow line. But the arrow has absolutely nothing to do with your contact point on this side. You have to exert your pressure through the grip of the bow and pull the bow back where you're exerting the pressure through the grip and through the string. So that's where you're exerting the tension, but not only that, the direction of it. What direction and how do you control the direction? The method that I use uses what's called angular motion or rotational motion. That's what Coach Lee always talks about. So the best way that I can describe, well, I'll draw it in a second. Angular motion exerts on the backside. So it's a rotational force that exerts the linear force on the arrow. And it's not a push-pull, because that's a linear technique, which is described by, if I'm just pushing and pulling, I'm pulling straight back and trying to control the direction of it that way, and that ends up being more bicep. The whole reason that we use Coach Lee's method is because you're using larger, bigger muscles, like the muscles in your back, your rhomboids, your traps, that type of stuff, as opposed to biceps and the stuff in your hand, okay? But the direction of that tension that you're exerting, it's angular on this side, and I'll show that to you guys a bit later, but the front half is extremely important. So most people, when, and I worked with you on it today. You were hidden, I thought you were sitting. Anyway, the bow arm, where you're controlling the tension that you're exerting onto the bow is extremely important, and it can gain you massive dividends in the long run, for sure. Especially if you start going to shoot field archery, that makes a huge difference, is what direction are you pushing the tension? And when you ask most people, you know, how are you pushing the bow? Or resisting the bow coming at you, depending on your technique. And they'll say, at the target. And then I say, okay, can you illustrate that to me with your arms as far as, or your finger as the direction of the tension? And they go, towards the target. That's not controlling your direction of the tension, right? That way is not consistent. If you're pushing the bow that direction, where do you think your arrows are going to go? That direction, right? So what I learned was when it was in 2016, towards the end of 2016, right before Rio, it really started to click in my head about this direction of the tension. It took me that long to finally feel it and understand what Coach Lee was trying to explain it to me. So if I'm shooting a 50-pound bow and I'm resisting it with 25 pounds of force and I'm adding more as I'm getting through the clicker, I'm pushing the pressure of where I hold onto my grip down here, and I'm pushing this spot in the 10 ring, towards the 10 ring, not towards the target and not somewhere that direction, but in the 10 ring, right? But then you can take it the next step further and not just the 10 ring, but push it in the center of the 10 ring, because your 10 ring, you know, at the top level, the difference between a 10 and a 9 can make the difference between a silver and a gold medal, and I can tell you that time and time again. It literally was, at Lord's, there's about that much difference between gold and silver at 70 meters away, so that's a big margin for error then if you're going for just the 10 ring. So you got to go for the X. Or if you're aiming off, wherever you're aiming off. If you're aiming off 6th ring right, that's your new 10 ring. You're pushing your force there. You're not pushing your force here. Because if your eyes are here and your sight pin's there and your pressure's going here, you're going to drift over to here then, instead of drifting an accurate amount that you're anticipating. It really started to make sense in 2015. It kind of started to make sense to me because I was starting to resist this direction and the direction of the tension towards the target. But I started shooting field archery. Well, I had been shooting field archery, but I went to a field tournament, and I felt like I executed the best I had ever executed, ever. I maybe made one or two mistakes the entire day, but my scores didn't reflect it. I kept having elevation discrepancies. Every time I'd step up to a new target, it'd be like, I'm either going to hit high or low 4, and I have no idea why, even though I knew the distance, right? Turns out I was exerting the direction of my tension towards the horizon, towards the direction of the target. So even if I was aiming downhill, I was pushing my tension that direction. So when the bow and the shot broke, I'd hit high. And it took me 95% of that first day to realize that I was pushing the tension in the wrong direction. I wasn't pushing it where I wanted that arrow to go with a deliberate force every single time. And it can pay dividends, especially when you're aiming off. So who here aims off when they're shooting outside in the wind? Good. I highly suggest that. I highly suggest never moving your sight because the wind is extremely inconsistent. And you guys live in a very windy environment, and you better learn how to aim off. So I can tell you from experience that most people, like I said, will put their sight pin here, but they really want their arrow to still go here. And just that simple mental change makes your shot weaker than as if you were to imagine this being your 10 ring that you're pushing towards, okay? So what does that mean? That means if you're shooting a weaker shot and the wind's blowing, you're gonna drift more because your arrows are not gonna come out of the bow the way that you tuned your bow to be. So they're gonna be flapping in the wind, and they're gonna catch more wind and drift more. And yeah, I use different vanes than most people, and I drifted less because of that, but even when I was shooting spin wings alongside Brady and Jacob Wookie and stuff, when we were still all shooting spin wings, I was drifting much less than they were. My bow wasn't any faster than them, I didn't shoot any more weight than them, and I definitely didn't have a longer draw length than them. but I drifted less, and I truly believe it was because I was fully committed to where I was aiming and pretending that this was my 10 ring and shooting with the same conviction that I would shoot here while I was aiming off. And that is a massive advantage, especially when it's really, really windy. Or you've got less time on your hands as well, because it can really mess with you. We're going to talk a little bit more about this after I get through the rest to kind of throw wrenches in the works, but does everybody understand what I mean by tension and direction? Okay, so you have to have a balanced equation, and you have to control the direction of it. Super important, super easy, doesn't matter what form you use, doesn't matter if it's compound recurve, bare bow, long bow, I don't care, it's all the same. You gotta have it balanced, you gotta control it. If you do, you can make huge improvements. Didn't you see a huge improvement in the way your bow jumped?
Just after between before and after you mentioned it, so.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a simple thing. It's not like I said, oh, change your anchor like I mentioned, but that's a whole lot harder change than just simply imagining resisting the bow in a different manner. So super easy, super important, extremely easy to do. Gotta do it.
So Jake,
Yeah.
How much movement are you feeling in that front half then when you're pushing into the grip, or is it more just a push and a resistance into your pressure point in the grip?
So the question, I don't know if everybody heard it, but the question was how much movement am I seeing in the bow as I'm resisting
Or how much movement are you feeling? And
yeah, I mean almost nothing, because when you achieve, and the way I shoot, there's a holding step, or when you achieve hold, it's after transfer, and so that's the time that I get to full draw to when I'm executing the shot. So when I'm expanding, I have, I mean, a millimeter, maybe 2 millimeters maximum to move on the clicker. So, and this is something that Coach Lee talks about as a ratio of movement. This is kind of a sidetrack note, but ratio of movement is, if I've got a millimeter to move here to set my clicker off, it's going to be really hard to see it. But if I make that length much bigger, and you watch my fingers as I'm saying, okay, I'm at holding, I'm expanding. I'm at holding, I'm expanding. So you can see movement here because it's much longer. But if I do that same movement here, you can't see it. So it's really nothing. It's almost more of a mental picture of what I'm trying to do. So as long as I'm deliberately controlling the direction of that movement, that's what's important. It's not really like I'm going, okay, put the arrow there. Although in the wind, it is a massive advantage if you're like this and you're genuinely scared that you're going to miss the target. When you sit there and you hold, and I don't know why, but it always seems like after the heaviest gust, there's always a little lull in the wind. So I'll be at full draw and it'll be like blow me off the target, and then I go back on the target and I go bang, and I drive it, because you can. As long as the ratio of movement, if you have control of that, and then you're controlling the tension in the direction, you can be quite aggressive with your expansion when you have to be. You know, time's running out on the clock, or the wind's blowing, or whatever it is. You know, your knock broke and you can't call an equipment failure because you're on, you know, in a match. Same thing. Did that answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so rhythm and timing. There's a couple ways to explain it, and there's a couple of different rhythm and timings within the shot that's important. Rhythm within my method is the rhythm of pull. Well, there's two different ways. The first way is how you pull your bow back, how you get to full draw. So for me, it is my rhythm that is important to me as within one shot is my loading, anchor, and transfer. So when I achieve basically full draw, when I anchor, and then when I'm settling into my shot and I'm taking the proverbial or the imaginative safety off of my rifle before I start squeezing the trigger. Okay? So the rhythm of loading, anchor, and transfer is very deliberate and controlled, that I do consistently every single time. It is 1, 2, 3. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. There is a delay or a slight pause between 2 and 3, only because the third step, the transfer step, takes a very long time. It's not just a step. So the load is not me pulling the bow back, the load, or the 1 is load position, is when I hit load. 2 is anchor position, and 3 is when transfer happens, when I'm ready to take the shot, when I take the safety off the gun, when I'm ready to execute. So there's rhythm within the shot, and then the timing within the shot is super simple. After transfer happens, to the point of the clicker clicking, that's timing, okay? You have to control your rhythm and timing. If you control your rhythm, you can control your timing, okay? Timing has to happen 2 to 3 seconds. You have to get the shot from the point of when you've acquired the target, when you start aiming, when you start expanding, when you start executing, whatever you want to call it, has to happen within 2 to 3 seconds. I haven't scientifically read literature, but according to people that I've talked to, the human brain can only focus on one single thing for about 2 to 3 seconds. After that, other thoughts start drifting into your head, and you have to recognize them and bring your thoughts back. So if anybody's done any breathing exercises where they focus on their breath, and you're supposed to only focus on your breath, you'll notice your thoughts drifting, and then you have to bring it back to your breath. It's a common thing, it happens to everybody. It's just the human brain. Supposedly the capacity is 2 to 3 seconds, so the whole idea of trying to control your timing is when you take that safety off, when you start executing, your clicker has to click within 2 to 3 seconds. 2 seconds is optimal, especially in the wind. You're looking at 1.5 to 2 seconds. If you can keep your timing consistent, everything building within your body is going to be consistent. Your blood pressure, your heart rate, all that type of stuff can be consistent from shot to shot. So if you can control these 2 things, each individual shot, you're going to be more consistent. Make sense? Okay. Now, rhythm within an end is also something that I experienced and experimented with towards the end of the last year that I was shooting. So what I mean by the rhythm within the end is it's like a machine. It's like I pull an arrow out, I put it in my bow, I pull it back, I shoot. I pull an arrow out, I put it in my bow, I pull it back, I shoot, and etc. It's like a dance. Like you have to continually hit the same motions, the same movements. It's super deliberate, super controlled. Try to control the entire end as a rhythm as a whole. You have to let down from time to time, but your general rhythm, your general flow, your general tempo, whatever you want to call it, throughout each shot, but that makes up the end. If you can try to control the end, you're starting to now control more and more factors, and you can end up being more and more consistent. If you look at Kim Woo-jin, you ever see, I'm sure there's videos where they give you the whole 72 arrows that he shot during a ranking round. He's a machine. Every single shot looks the same, to the point of where he adjusts his glasses before every single shot the exact same way, in the exact same manner, and at the exact same time. Every single time he loads his arrow into the bow, he takes a breath and he goes, wiggles his glasses, and he goes and shoots every single arrow. I don't think you have, for him, and when I shot in glasses, I had to constantly push them back to make sure I could see. Super important if you have corrective lenses to make sure they're in the same place, because if they're not, it'll distort your vision and totally throw stuff off. But I shoot in contacts now, so I'm good to go there. That doesn't mean I would say, adjust your arm guard in the same manner every single time before every single shot. If that's part of your shot sequence, your mental routine, whatever, great. Power to you. I'm glad you're controlling the end as a whole with that rhythm. Does that make sense, rhythm and timing?
Yeah.
Pretty simple and easy. What's really important about this, rhythm will become subconscious and second nature as you do the same thing over and over and over and over again. So, your rhythm of within one shot, that 1, 2, 3, will become second nature once you get used to it. Once you do it enough, once you shoot your, 10,000 hours of practice the same way, it'll definitely become second nature. But the timing is super important. In the Sydney Games in 2000, Tim Cudahy, the bronze medalist, not the best shooter before that tournament, struggling, hit or miss. Still a good shooter, but very hit or miss. And he was the only one that apparently, according to Coach Lee, he was the only one that approached Coach Lee and said, Coach, what do I need to do more than anything else in this tournament to be successful? What do I need to do? But like, what is my primary objective or focus within this entire tournament? And Coach Lee said timing. You have to shoot your arrow within 2 seconds after you come to full draw, or after you transfer when you take the safety off, right? And the reason is because it was a very windy tournament and extremely inconsistent in the wind. So the whole idea was he was trying to not sit there and wait for the wind or play that game to hope that it's better. He deliberately made a choice to control timing above all else, and he won bronze. And he did quite well. Definitely one of the best tournaments he had, for sure, as far as consistent performance goes throughout the entire tournament and the weekend. So timing is definitely important, especially, you get up on the Olympic stage in front of millions of people on TV and your heart's not the same heart rate, but if you can control your rhythm and timing, you have a better chance of the outcome being a little bit more consistent, or at least not being a 6 on your first arrow because your heart rate's through the moon. You can, control it a bit better. Anyway.
So what are your top tips then for somebody to bring that timing into the pressure situation of a tournament from practice?
So one quick tip would be, and I'll draw this later a bit more, but if this was your intensity scale of 10 to 0, this is 5, and then we'll say this is when transfer is on this line, and then here is your release. So within here is expansion, okay? I'll expand on this a bit more. If you're not having any issues with keeping your timing, ideally you want to slowly and consistently add intensity to your expansion as you're expanding. So as you're expanding, it's not like it's a flat line. This is supposed to be increasing. This is an upward trend, okay? As time is going on, you're supposed to be exerting a bit more intensity to make sure that you're staying consistent here. However, if timing is going longer and longer, you should start doing this, and you start noticing you're getting closer to your clicker not going off, and you start ramping it up like a bell-shaped curve. So even though I say a 2 to 3 second time window, we'll say this is 2 seconds, and then this is 3 seconds. So once I hit the 2 second mark mentally, you can just tell if the shot's starting to go long. You start ramping up intensity instead of continuing forward. So, and in Rio and London, in order to keep timing, I had to make sure that, so I forget, what did Coach Lee call it? Like an urgency. I don't remember his exact word. It made sense, but like not necessarily an urgency, but there's another word, maybe it'll come to mind, but you have to know that this is your window. If you hit here, you better start over. Although sometimes you don't have that option, especially in team round or single arrow, alternating arrow match play, right? So because you don't have that option to let down, you're committing, before you even start the shot, you've already committed to doing this mentally. So once you hit this point, you know that you need to start ramping up intensity.
Would you suggest that people count in their head?
It's different for everybody. There's 2 different types of people. In my experience, there's a word thought process versus a feeling thought process. Mm-hmm. So it's either words that make sense to you or feelings. For me, it's feelings. So I feel the tension in my body as opposed to saying the words of transfer or loading anchor. Transfer, like some people will say hook, grip, set, and loading anchor transfer, and then they'll count. Some people do that. I'm just not that. I'm not that type of person. I go by feel. So it's up to you. Although, to me, if I had to suggest anything, if you're going to be a word person, I think you should be thinking about one singular word and just monitoring time and space as it's, progressing as you're at full draw. I've never not been able to notice when my shot went long, and I would hope that most everybody else can at least recognize when they held too long or longer than normal. Okay, so now the last one, which is again just kind of important things, is movements versus muscles, or muscles versus movements, either way you want to say it. Best way to explain it is if I said, okay, move my hand up towards my face. That's easy, simple. But if I said, flex my bicep to move my hand towards my face, if I'm really good, I can just say, okay, squeeze my bicep, my hand raises. That's the muscle that makes the hand move up, okay? But if I was worried about the muscle instead of moving my hand, I could say, flex my bicep to move my hand to my face, and I could go, and I'm flexing my bicep, but it's not moving at all, okay? So it's the movement that you need to think about, not the muscle, for that exact reason. If you think about the back tension and you say, oh, your rhomboid or your lower trap or whatever it is, if you think about muscles, I guarantee you can flex that muscle and not be able to expand or move because of that same reason. You could flex the opposing muscle at the same time that you're flexing the muscle that you want to talk about, and because you're flexing it more, you're feeling it more. And that's not what you want. Yeah, you're going to feel more back tension, but you're not feeling the right kind of back tension. The whole idea is to move correctly with the correct structure, not use the correct muscles. Once you start talking about muscles, and whoever's a coach in this room, don't talk about muscles at all. If you talk about muscles, they're going to think about muscles, and they're going to flex them, they're not going to be able to move, and they're totally not understanding the point. If they're moving correctly, they're going to be using the correct muscles. If I'm moving my hand up towards my face, it's not like I'm flexing my quad to make my hand move. I'm flexing the correct muscle to make my hand move. So it's really simple. You really just have to focus on your structure moving correctly. If that's moving correctly, you will be using the correct muscles. So that could be, again, however you want to play it. For me, the correct movement was this spot right here. This is what Coach Lee named in his method. Apparently, this is an actual medical term called land 1 here. And Coach Lee said, okay, if this is land 1, then this is land 2. So land 2 means literally nothing in the medical community, but apparently land 1, LAN1 does. I don't know what it means. Doesn't really matter, but Coach Lee said, okay, this is land 2. So his whole idea is if you're moving land 2 correctly around and behind you, so if it's as you're pulling back and your land 2 is moving around and behind you, you're using the correct muscles. If your land 2 is not moving correctly behind you, and I'm just using back tension, bicep tension, or I could use back tension and move it around me correctly. Does that make sense about muscles versus movements? Okay. Hopefully we'll be able to do at least a little bit of a demonstration with land 2 and the proper movement, but super simple, right? Any other questions before we move forward on this?
Can I just say something? When I was starting out, I was always told muscle memory. But from what you're saying there, we're better off saying movement memory, aren't we really? Because muscles don't have memories, do they?
No, that's a misnomer.
So
Muscles definitely don't have memory. It comes from your central nervous system.
So we should start thinking about movement memory.
Yeah, definitely. You should really, this is the primary driver of movement.
Okay.
So the whole idea is if you are moving correctly, you will be using the correct muscles.
Yeah.
If you're moving with the correct tension and direction that you're controlling, you can absolutely control that rhythm and timing correctly all together. So everything ends up playing together, and without one of these things, it ends up being quite difficult. This is just kind of an added thing, but it's more or less just to deal with this type of issue, because as you're changing intensity, as your shot's getting longer, as you're not hitting your same marks consistently like a machine, how can you expect the same outcome or a tight group every single time if you're not trying to control all factors the same? And time is definitely a factor. Cool? All right. So since we're on this subject, I'm going to finish this up real quick. The intensity graph, I'm going to draw one for you guys. I'll make it bigger so you can see it in the back. So this is intensity. The best way to describe intensity is this is 0, this is 10. All right, I'm squeezing my hand as hard as I possibly can. And within a very short period of time, right about now, I start to lose blood flow in my hand and therefore feeling in my hand. So now I can't really feel what my hand's doing, or at least where my fingers are in my palm. So it just, it doesn't make sense to be at 10. But I can close my hand with a 2. There's a couple parents out here, I'm sorry to say this, but I suggest always being as lazy as humanly possible with archery, okay? Not with school or anything else, but definitely with archery. Okay, so the whole point of what I'm about to show you is if I can do something with a 2, that is absolutely what you should be doing it with. Do not do it any higher at all. Obviously, pulling the bow back is not exactly a natural movement. So I'm going to draw really quick my shot cycle. Okay, so from here, really quick, is set, up, load, anchor, transfer, because it takes time again, 1, 2, 3, right? 1, 2, 3. And then that's when holding is achieved. When you start expanding, there's a release, and then I guess follow through is this point here. Okay, so does everybody understand these steps already? I've kind of exposed them a little bit, so I don't have to explain them in full detail. Okay, so intensity. Again, like I said, 0 to 10. As you're pulling the bow back, it is not natural. As you're starting to go from set to setup, so I always suggest starting right around a 2 because, again, like I said, if you're going to do something, do it with a 2. You don't need to go to 10. As I'm starting to lift the bow up and get into setup, as I start to pull the bow back and hit anchor, my intensity is starting to go up, probably somewhere around a 5, give or take. But as I start transferring, my intensity is going to come down, and it's going to come down probably somewhere around a 2. That's ideal. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Actually, I'll just talk about it now. Okay, so the whole idea of transfer, there is a physical movement. There's the movement of engaging more with your back. You're going to give that little extra rounding with the back half. But more importantly, what transfer is it's a mental step. I already told you, basically, it's like taking the safety off your rifle before you're going to go shoot. So what that means is I'm pulling back, I've got more intensity, but then as I transfer, it's like I'm relaxing, trying to clear my brain, trying to get ready to actually start executing. And then once I acquire the target with the sight pin, and then I start executing, then I'm going to slowly start building intensity up as I'm going through. Okay, does that make sense where this comes from, this dip? But as I'm expanding, the release happens, and ideally it should continue this way. Your intensity of pushing the bow forward and rotating around back should continue. That intensity trajectory needs to continue going through release and be undisturbed at release all the way until you finish the shot, when follow through ends. So follow through ends when you can't move anymore, or when your finger touches the back of your neck, or whatever you'd like to do. The intensity does not get disturbed from release. How many people do you see shoot a shot, go like this and go, right? What is happening there is they get up here into transfer, they don't transfer, and then they get to holding and they start expanding and they go up, they hit release and it goes because they're not controlling this part. This part is super easy to control. It's, again, just a mental thing. This can happen, this happens, or this, or a pluck, or a collapse, or whatever it is, happens simply because they don't have this in mind. They're not focusing on the finish. They're not focusing on their end of their follow-through. Very simple, very easy. Something that Coach Lee says is, this is the A position, this is B position, which is when you're at holding, when you're ready to shoot, when you take the safety off, and this is C position. You have to hit C, and you have to think about C while you're at full draw, how you're expanding, how I'm exerting that pressure through the bow. I'm ultimately wanting to hit here. I'm not wanting to make the clicker click. Obviously you do, but if you're focused so much on the clicker clicking, which means release, this happens, not this happening. Okay, so part of this method and what's important about transfer is it's a mental thing to drop, lower your intensity, and then continue controlling that till you finish. Don't do this. I don't know about most UK shooters, but definitely most Americans shoot like this. Especially adults. Most adults shoot like that. So, that makes sense? Super simple, super easy to control. You just gotta do it. But ultimately you gotta think about C. So, is there an arrow I can borrow? Doesn't have to be, yeah, just grab me one of them arrows. Thank you. I'll try to do it up here. I'm gonna do it. Yeah. So if this is A, this is B, and this is C, if I am deliberately controlling the arrow and I'm trying to make it go to C, I can bring it up to B. It's hard on the slippery. Oh, that's right there. If I'm bringing it up to B and I'm trying to get it to C and I help it along the way, it will fall and land at C every single time. You just got to help it just a little bit. But if I bring it up to B, if I transfer, but I'm not thinking about C, and I'm not thinking about the direction I want C to be, I just don't, there's no consistency to where it falls. Sometimes it'll fall in that direction. Sometimes it'll fall backwards. Sometimes it'll fall sideways. Either way, you bring it to B, you transfer, and you start expanding, but you don't really put direction on it. Again, sometimes it will land there, but chances are it won't. So if you come to B and transfer, and then push yourself, go towards C, it's always going to hit C. And if it's always hitting C, that's consistency, and that's accuracy, that's groups, and if you have groups, you can move your sight, and they can be in the middle. Make sense? So again, you got to calm down, and then you have to think about this. That's just the easiest way to explain it. Thanks. Where are we at? So that's main importances within form that I can definitely impart on everybody by just telling you to think about things differently. A lot of the other things, and we'll go over the finger stuff, a lot of the other things requires a lot more hands-on stuff, and we definitely don't have time for a lot of hands-on things. But that covers the majority of stuff that I can impart on you right now. So is there any questions within this stuff before we kind of go forward?
When you get to the transfer, do you hold? Do you stop pulling?
No. So that's
So it's a continuous pull.
a misnomer and an unfortunate term in Coach Lee's things. Yeah, holding is not actually a pause. It's not a stop. There is a mental check to make sure, but there's so many things that are happening within transfer. So as transfer is starting, you're rotating around a bit more, you're trying to add more tension in your back, trying to make sure you don't have any excess intensity built up, right? And you're trying to calm down, but you're also aiming at the same time and, making sure your sight picture is good or whatever it is that you're doing. You're also, and ideally, according to what I suggest and Coach Lee suggests, is there's a breath out slowly as you're transferring, but once you hit holding, that's when all of that stuff stops. You're already supposed to be aiming by then, you're supposed to hold your breath by then, you're not dropping your intensity anymore, and you're actually going to start executing right away. So there is no stop.
Sorry, go on.
Very good.
Do you suggest setting up on or watching your point under the clicker, sort of see where you are? I remember when Total Archery first came out, that was there, and that was kind of quite a big thing to make that. So it's like, oh my god, you're saying you look at your clicker, and that kind of went against everything that I've been taught. And then if you watch World Cup videos, and so probably maybe a third of archers at that level might set up or look. Some do, some don't. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I do. I checked my clicker position at the load position though, way back here. Because aiming absolutely does not happen from here back. You absolutely do not aim until you are at full draw. Absolutely. I don't, if you do the push-pull linear motion continual movement, as the Koreans do, they aim before they pull the bow back. And you can clearly see it when it's windy outside. And the best way I can show you it is, I don't care how much the wind's blowing, I'm gonna pull my bow back and anchor, transfer. And then when the wind stops, I'm aiming and I'm gonna shoot. Whereas the Koreans, they go, and they never pull their bow back. They won't pull their bow back. If the wind's blowing, with the exception of Oh Jin Heck, because he doesn't do push-pull, and he's not continual motion, and he holds, they sit there and the wind's blowing like this, and they won't pull their bow back. And there's a couple points to that. If you ever watch them shoot blank bail, the string never touches their face. The clicker clicks and the arrow goes. Am I right? Yeah. So, and the best ones will even, in finals matches, they don't even hit their anchor. The clicker clicks, they fire the arrow. Because they're aiming way back here. They get the bow, they put the sight in the middle, and then they pull back like this, and then as soon as it touches their face, bang, shot's gone. Anyway, aiming, what was the question again? I want to make sure I cover it.
Just wonder what your comments were on setting up and looking at the clicker and when, where, and why.
So, because I'm not aiming here, I'm not distracting visually from anything that's important. And to me, what I found, it's a bit of a beginner move to check your clicker. However, I found that under pressure in finals matches and team rounds, my timing was not consistent. I'd have some shots break in 3 seconds, some shots break in 5 seconds, some shots wouldn't break, and I'd have to let down. And I found, thanks to Coach Lee standing there with me for hours and recording videos, he finally was like, you're not consistently loading to the same place every single time. So what I did was, and he suggested, as I pulled back right when I got to the end of load position, right before I came into anchor, I'll visually look down at my clicker. And as long as my clicker started to move down over the bulge of the point, I was close enough. I did just release a video on my YouTube channel about load and loading, and I covered my eyes, and you can actually, I tried to demonstrate it as best I could to the camera, and I zoomed in a couple times, and you could see my eyes go down and just check the clicker real quick as I was pulling back, right at the end of load. So yeah, it's okay. I recommend it. Coach Lee would recommend it. I didn't tell the whole group, but Coach Lee did not write the latest Inside the Archer. Tyler Benner wrote it, which is one of my teammates that was at the training center. He was an RA for 2 to 3 years, give or take. A decent shooter, extremely over-analytical person, and definitely wrote the book, and then went to Coach Lee and said, hey, I wrote you a new book, what do you think? That's kind of how that worked. It wasn't Coach Lee writing it. It has great information in there. None of it's wrong. However, there is added information. There's nuance in there. There are things that are way more important than the million other steps that ended up getting written in there because of, the over-analytical person that he is. However, if you've watched any of my videos on YouTube, you'll see, well, it's a simple step. Load is here, but there's 30 things that are happening while that is happening. So yeah, there's 30 steps of each step, but what's the most important ones? These. I don't care how you shoot as long as you do these correctly. So, good? You had a question?
Yeah, my question, you kind of answered it, was aiming. At which point do you start bringing the sight pin onto the target?
Yep.
And then focusing on the sight pin?
Yeah,
So where
that's
stage
here.
does that happen?
It's finalized at when the safety comes off and you start acquiring the target during the transfer phase. Again, that's why it takes 1, 2, 3. There's so many things that are happening during 3. There's the mental checklist, there's the calming down, there's the aiming, etc. So, really important. But what's most important about it is the mental. You have to take, that's a mental commitment to the shot, and not only the shot, but also this has to happen within 2 to 3 seconds, so it's okay to start ramping intensity up as you're getting closer and closer to your time window expiring.
I'll expand. So I'm doing a little bit of work on that load, anchor, transfer, aiming thing. So if I close my eyes, do those steps and open, my sight's nowhere near the target that I'm trying to go for. What perhaps could I do to improve that
Well, we already talked a little bit about your bow shoulder and how you reach towards the target. So if I'm coming up to setup, I mean, my hand, if your face is my target, just watch where my vision is and what interrupts it. So as I come up into set up from set to setup, you'll see that my hand completely covers you, which would be the target face. As I come into this position and then I'm there. So it's controlled. The sight pin isn't 30 feet off the target or 10 meters off the target in your terms. Although, by the way, why are your roads in miles an hour and yards when nobody knows? I don't know. Anyway, I'm controlling it. Like, my sight pin is close.
Yeah.
It might be down here, it might be here. Especially if it's windy, it's not really going to be super close. It's somewhere close, but I'm not trying to put it right here. Okay, so you can keep it somewhere on the face, but right when you start transferring, you need to bring your focus down. Okay, and the whole point again was just the timing thing, because if you're worried about aiming back here, you've got 5 to 8 seconds to this point, whereas from here you've got 2 to 3 seconds. And again, that human brain thing of the focus, trying to keep it within a window that you can control, so not having it here on the level of importance allows you to focus on the actual important things back here, and then once you're done there, then you can focus on the aiming from there point forward. Make sense? Cool. I was going to say something and I forgot. Anyway, not for it. So fingers on the string, you had a question about how I hook.
Yeah.
So the hook that I do, if I draw, for people that are here, if I draw my fingers, my ring finger is longer than my index finger, which isn't, everybody's different. So if these are my fingers, always put your string on this side of your first joint. So everybody can see that these are my fingers, this is the first joint, that's what that line represents. Your string on your fingertips should always be on this side. It should absolutely never be on this side of your joint, okay? And absolutely never be inside the joint itself as well. I covered this again in a YouTube video too, but why you never put it in your joint is if you look at the joint and you can take your finger and push on there, there is no meat between your finger, which would be the string, and the bone that's in your finger, and also not just your bone, but also the nerves in your fingers. If anybody here has shot from a decent amount of time and never had finger numbness and tingling going on, probably because you had a improper hook and the string was in the joint, and what you actually did is probably killed a little bit of the nerves in your fingers. And for me at least, once that happened, it took about 2 weeks for the nerves to regrow and for that numbness to go away. I had numbness for 2 weeks straight, right? So do not put it in the joint. And on top of that, how do you protect it even more? I always suggest to start at your fingertips and curl them to get your string in the proper position. Do not start here and allow it to slide this way to get into the proper position. So the whole point of that, and this maybe we'll have to have everybody see it or I'll walk around, is if I started like this and hooked my fingers on and then let it slide forward into the correct position, it takes all the meat that is in this part of your finger and pushes it forward towards your fingertips. So it's going to do two things. One, it doesn't protect the joint at all. And two, you've got a whole lot of material built up in front of you, your fingertips, so when you release, that string has to push all that meat out of the way as it's going by. If you started at your fingertips like this and then curled your fingers, all that meat is now shoved back towards the joint, and you have padding in the joint itself, plus there's no longer all that meat that the string has to push out of the way.
It was the curling back bit that I didn't quite catch.
Yeah. So you start on your fingertips and then you roll the string in and you get into position.
Got it. Yeah.
So if I'm like this, you can see that there's no meat between my finger and the joint. If I start like this, you can see all that meat that's built up there. So I'll show you guys.